On September 30th, 1955, James Dean was driving toward a race in California when everything ended on a stretch of road that would become part of Hollywood myth forever. He was only 24. That fact alone still feels unreal. James Dean did not die after a long career, a slow decline, or a fading public image. He died at the exact moment his face was beginning to burn itself into popular culture. The crash came too early for people to understand it, too suddenly for the public to process it, and too violently for his image to remain untouched by it. What had been a rising young actor became, in an instant, a dead body, a shattered car, a breaking headline, and the beginning of one of the most haunting legends in film history. There is something especially cruel about a death like that. The world had barely finished discovering James Dean before it was already being asked to mourn him. The shock was not only that he was gone, it was the kind of man the world believed it was losing. James Dean did not look like someone meant to die young. He looked dangerous, yes, but in the glamorous way audiences are taught to admire. He looked restless, magnetic, beautiful, and far too alive to be reduced to silence on the side of a road. By the time news of his death spread, he was already becoming more than an actor. He was turning into a face audiences could not ignore. The wounded boy, the rebel, the beautiful outsider with a sadness behind his eyes. And then, before the image had time to settle, death sealed it in place. That is part of what made the tragedy so powerful. James Dean was never forced to grow old, lose his mystery, or outlive his own legend. He vanished before the world could see him become ordinary. In death, he did not merely disappear, he froze. From that moment on, he would belong forever to the age of youth, speed, danger, and unfinished promise. But that is also what makes his story darker than simple celebrity tragedy. The crash did not only kill a young star, it created a myth so powerful that it almost swallowed the human being inside it. Over time, the wrecked Porsche, the fatal highway, the black and white photographs, and the words, "dead at 24, became inseparable from James Dean himself. His death was no longer just an event. It became part of his image, as if the world could not remember his beauty without also remembering the violence that destroyed it. And maybe that is why his story still feels so disturbing even now. James Dean did not just die young. He died in the one way that seemed to confirm everything people thought they saw in him. The danger, the defiance, the sense that he was always moving too fast for the world to keep. But before he became a wrecked car, a newspaper headline, and a legend fixed forever in youth, he was just a lonely boy from Indiana, carrying the first quiet cracks of a life the public had not yet begun to mythologize. Long before James Dean became the face of restless youth, he was just a boy growing up far from Hollywood, in a life that looked ordinary from the outside and felt much less simple from within. He was born in Marion, Indiana, and spent much of his early life in a landscape that had none of the glamour later attached to his name. There were no flashing cameras, no studios, no crowds waiting to see him. What existed instead was a quieter America. Small towns, family routines, church-going communities, and the kind of life where people were expected to grow into something steady, practical, and familiar. But even inside that world, James Dean did not seem entirely built for stillness. There was already something inward about him, something observant, emotional, and difficult to place. He did not yet look like a legend, but he already carried the kind of inner distance that would later make people stare at his face and feel that something in him was always slightly elsewhere. That distance deepened early. The loss of his mother marked him in a way that would echo through the rest of his life, and it is hard to overstate how much that kind of childhood grief can shape a person before they have the language to understand it. After her death, he was sent to live with relatives in Fairmount, Indiana, and from there, the emotional landscape of his youth became one of displacement as much as belonging. He had roots, but he also had rupture. He had people around him, but not the simple emotional security that makes childhood feel whole. In that kind of environment, a person can become many things at once: sensitive yet guarded, hungry for love yet afraid of depending on it, eager to be seen yet deeply suspicious of being understood. Those contradictions would later define much of James Dean's presence as an actor and as a man. Even before fame, there was already a loneliness in him that did not look dramatic on the surface, but seemed to live quietly underneath everything. It was the kind of loneliness that can harden into independence, then into performance, then into myth. And yet, that same wounded inwardness may also have been part of what gave James Dean his force. He was not shaped only by loss, but by a growing sense that he did not entirely belong to the life set out in front of him. There are people who move comfortably within the world they are born into, and others who carry from early on the feeling that they are meant to escape it. James Dean seemed to belong to the second kind. Even before fame, there was already tension between the place he came from and the life he appeared to be moving toward. He was athletic, expressive, unpredictable, and more emotionally charged than the world around him seemed prepared for. The boy in Indiana was not yet the rebel the world would worship, but the early outlines were already there. The hunger to become someone larger than his surroundings, the refusal to settle into quiet normalcy, and the private ache that made his future image feel less invented than revealed. Before the leather jacket, the cigarette, and the tragic immortality, there was just a young man carrying grief, longing, and a restless need to become visible in a world that had not yet learned his name.
By the time James Dean began moving toward acting seriously, it was already clear that he was not built to disappear into the background. He did not have the polished ease of a conventional leading man, nor the safe charm that studios could package without risk. What made him powerful was something far less controlled. He carried tension. Even before he was famous, there was something unsettled in the way he looked at people, in the way he moved, in the way emotions seemed to sit so close to the surface without ever becoming fully readable. That quality made him different from the men Hollywood had already known how to sell. James Dean did not feel finished. He felt raw, volatile, and emotionally exposed in a way that seemed almost dangerous, and that danger became part of his appeal. When he committed himself to acting, he was not simply learning lines or working toward a career. He was moving toward the one place where all the contradiction inside him, the loneliness, the hunger, the softness, the anger, could become visible without needing to be explained. That is why his rise felt so immediate once it began. James Dean did not become famous by looking stable. He became famous by making emotional instability feel honest, magnetic, and unforgettable. On screen, he seemed to embody something that was bigger than performance. He looked like someone carrying private wounds in public, someone too sensitive to fit comfortably inside the world around him, and too restless to pretend otherwise. For audiences, especially younger ones, that felt revolutionary. He was not offering the old version of masculinity built on confidence, control, and certainty. He was offering something more fractured and more human, a young man who could look defiant one second and devastated the next. That emotional instability became the center of his power. It was not weakness. It was recognition. People looked at James Dean and felt that he represented a generation that was tired of pretending to be untouched. He became a face for alienation, rebellion, longing, and the terrible beauty of not knowing how to belong. But once that image took hold, it began to grow beyond him. James Dean was no longer just a young actor with promise. He was becoming an atmosphere, a symbol, a visual language all by himself. The red jacket, the cigarette, the lowered eyes, the slouched posture, the sadness mixed with resistance, all of it turned into iconography almost instantly. He gave the world a new kind of youth, not cheerful, not obedient, not polished into acceptability, but wounded, impatient, and burning with feeling. That is why his fame expanded so quickly. He did not merely play rebellion, he seemed to carry it in his body. And yet, that is also where the danger began. The more powerfully the public connected to James Dean as an image, the easier it became for the image to swallow the man. The world was not only admiring his talent anymore, it was beginning to mythologize his pain, romanticize his distance, and freeze his unrest into something beautiful. He had become the face of a generation that did not know where to place its own sadness. And the brighter that image burned, the harder it became to separate the young man from the legend being built around him in real time. The image the world loved was powerful, but it was never truly stable. What made James Dean so magnetic was also what made him difficult, restless, and hard to contain. He did not seem built for calm success or the smooth rhythm of an ordinary rise to fame. Even as his name grew larger, there was still something unsettled in him, something that resisted being fully possessed by Hollywood, by the public, or even by the people closest to him. He could seem warm one moment and unreachable the next. He wanted attention, but not control. He wanted to be seen, but not simplified. That contradiction sat at the center of his personality and at the center of his appeal. The sadness people saw in his face was not an invention created by photographers or studio publicity. It felt real because some part of it was real. Beneath the beauty, beneath the new fame, there was still a young man shaped by grief, distance, and a private instability that no amount of admiration could completely soften. That instability did not always look dramatic from the outside. Sometimes it looked like moodiness, impatience, intensity, or a refusal to fit neatly into the systems around him. But that is often how deeper unrest appears, when it is still being romanticized by the world. James Dean's image benefited from the fact that his fractures looked beautiful in public. His distance became mystery, his volatility became charm, his loneliness became depth. The same qualities that might have seemed troubling in an ordinary person became intoxicating in a young star whose face already carried the shadow of myth. And that is part of what makes his story feel so disturbing in hindsight. The public was not only watching a talented actor rise, it was also falling in love with the visible signs of a life slightly out of balance. James Dean did not represent safe stardom. He represented a kind of emotional danger that looked thrilling from far away. But danger is only glamorous until it becomes irreversible. Nothing revealed that more clearly than his attraction to speed. Cars were not just a hobby around James Dean's image. They felt almost symbolic of the way he moved through life itself. Speed carries seduction, the illusion of freedom, power, escape, and control. But it also carries risk, especially for someone already drawn to intensity. In James Dean's case, the fascination with racing and fast driving did not feel separate from the man the world thought it knew. It felt like an extension of him. He lived with urgency, with appetite, with the energy of someone trying to outrun stillness itself. That is why the crash in Part 1 feels so haunting even now. It was a literal accident, yes, but it also seems like the point where image, personality, and fate collided in the cruelest possible way. James Dean did not live long enough to lose his beauty, outgrow his rebellion, or become less mysterious with time. He disappeared at the exact moment the world had started to believe that his danger was part of his brilliance. And maybe that is the darkest truth beneath his legend. The qualities that made him unforgettable were also the ones that made it feel, even then, as if he was burning through life too quickly to stay.
When James Dean was laid to rest, the grief surrounding him carried a strange and painful quality that belongs only to certain kinds of deaths. It was not just sorrow for a young actor who had died too soon. It was the shock of watching possibility turn into permanence overnight. James Dean had not yet lived long enough to become a veteran star, to fade, to fail, to reinvent himself, or to outgrow the image that made people watch him so intensely. And because of that, his funeral did not feel like the closing chapter of a completed life. It felt like the burial of a future that had been violently cut off before the world had even fully seen what it might become. That is part of what made the mourning around him so different. People were not only saying goodbye to who James Dean had been, they were grieving everything he would now never have the chance to become. In death, he was no longer a promising young actor. He had become the most haunting version of youth itself, beautiful, unfinished, and gone before time could touch him. After his death, the meaning of his image changed almost instantly. The same face that had once signaled rebellion, desire, sensitivity, and danger now carried something heavier. It became inseparable from loss. Every old photograph, every still frame, every cigarette, every lowered glance, every moment of wounded defiance on screen began to feel touched by the knowledge of what was coming. That is one of the most brutal things about an early death. The past no longer stays innocent. Once the ending is known, the entire archive begins to ache. James Dean's beauty was no longer only beauty. It was evidence of fragility. His rebelliousness was no longer only glamour. It was a ghost of the fatal urgency that had helped destroy him. And that is how the legend deepened. He was not simply remembered as talented. He was remembered as permanently young, permanently unfinished, permanently standing at the exact edge where youth becomes myth because it is never forced to survive long enough to decay into something ordinary. In that sense, James Dean did not merely leave behind films or photographs. He left behind one of the most enduring emotional images in modern celebrity culture, the boy who never had time to become a man. That is why James Dean has remained alive in public memory long after so many bigger, longer, and more complete careers have faded. He was preserved by tragedy in the one form the world finds hardest to let go of. Youth interrupted at its peak. The clothing, the posture, the sadness, the danger, the beauty, the silence inside his face. All of it became more than style after his death. It became inheritance. Generation after generation kept returning to him, not only because he was talented, but because he seemed to embody a universal fear and desire at once. The fear of disappearing too soon, and the desire to be remembered forever in one unforgettable form. James Dean never lived long enough to explain himself, revise himself, or survive his own image. And maybe that is why the image still holds. It was sealed before life could wear it down. In the end, the world did not just bury James Dean. It buried a young man and created a legend in the same motion. He did not live long enough to become the past. He died at exactly the right moment to become something colder, sadder, and far more permanent, a beautiful boy fixed forever in the moment before time could take the light from his face.